Thank you so much, Gary, and thank you to Aleph Institute and Columbia Law School for giving us the opportunity to have this exciting conversation. I'm so honored to be joined by some of the most innovative prosecutors in the country today. DA John Creuzot from Dallas, DA Rachael Rollins from Suffolk County, Massachusetts, and DA Larry Krasner from Philadelphia. We're going to start with a little bit of stage setting so you understand what it is these folks have been up against in their time in office. And I'm just going to ask that each of you talk about what it is you inherited when you first came to the DA's office.
I guess that's me. Okay. What did I inherit? I inherited a fortress of people who thought it was still 1954, who thought Brady was optional, if they even knew what Brady was, who had a draconian, retributive, and punitive view of criminal justice that served the politics of incumbency and the politics of the elected officials who, for the most part, viewed it as a launch pad. And I will keep this answer crisp, I promise. But let us not forget Arlen Specter was District Attorney of Philadelphia County, Ed Rendell, who was then the mayor, then the governor, then BFFs with Bill Clinton, was the District Attorney of Philadelphia County at age 35. And some of these folks stayed in those positions for 19 years. So that's what I inherited.
I inherited an office that knew what Brady was, but thought it was probably Tom Brady, because we're from Boston. But no, they knew. I inherited an office of very good prosecutors. However, we had really bad disparities with respect to racial, the racial implications of whom we arrest and who we prosecute. And I inherited an office that had fully supported an individual in the primary who was the chief of the gang unit and had the endorsement and support of the outgoing DA and all of law enforcement. And so culture change is very hard. I inherited an office of excellent prosecutors, but 87% of them were white, in an area where overwhelmingly 87% of the people we prosecute are not, and that doesn't mean they aren't excellent lawyers, but I think we needed a little bit more cultural sensitivity and understanding, which is a massive paradigm shift for us, that we are the government and we work for the people we serve.
Well, I inherited an office of about 500 employees and a $50 million budget. And being a solo practitioner for the last 6 years and operating with a computer and a scanner and everything was digital, that was quite a change for me. So what I did discover, though, in the first 6 weeks of just intense focus and study on the different sections of the district attorney's office was that the trial bureau section was the one that got the most attention, but the other sections, which are necessary to operate effectively as a district attorney's office, had long been ignored. And so I'm still in the process of trying to discover what they do and have them justify to me their existence. The other thing I discovered is that we are very focused on dispositions, but not effective dispositions. And that we have all these papers that tell us how many cases we've moved, but we have no idea about recidivism rates. We have no idea about cost effectiveness. We have not paid attention, and I know this because I spent 22 years as a state district judge, so I know that the DA's office in Dallas never paid attention to jail population. We never paid attention to the number of women who we're sending to jail. We never paid attention to conditions. We are pretty good and have been pretty good for a number of years on Brady. We're upgrading those, updating those requirements, but we're also focusing on police officers that because of their past, internal past, or maybe past in the courtroom, we will never sponsor as a witness, and that's become quite controversial with the police agencies. And of course, when you talk criminal justice reform, and you talk about not prosecuting certain cases, and you're in Dallas, Texas, with a very conservative, almost completely Anglo, 50 to 60-year-old population of police chiefs, you get a lot of pushback, and they've decided to play politics, and which is kind of getting into our realm. And so I think that they have a plan that I won't be reelected, but we'll see how that goes.
I'm going to encourage everyone in the audience to read their bios so you have a sense of the very varied experience that these three DAs bring to their work. But I would ask you each to tell us when you took office, and then what is the first step you took when you entered your office?
Same order. So I took office January of 2018, which means I'm about 18 months in. One of the first steps we took was that we separated some people. Not a terribly large number of people as compared to prior administrations, but we did it for the outrageous reason that we thought they would not be either capable of or willing to carry out the mission, as opposed, this was quite controversial, as opposed to the usual acceptable reason, which is politics. They were all Republicans, they got to go, that sort of thing. So we actually did it because we figured there was a mission, and people who were unalterably opposed to it or had a long record of unethical or inappropriate conduct couldn't stay. Rather important, because I think some people view a, quote, progressive prosecutor, unquote, for example, somebody who was a public defender, a defense attorney, and a civil rights lawyer for 30 years as being a bunch of sloppy hippies who are unwilling to do difficult things. But they just want to let everybody out of jail because they don't want to punish anybody for anything. Well, it made an impression, honestly. People figured out pretty quickly that if they were not willing to do the job, this of course did not mean they had to agree with us. We're not the thought police, but if they were not willing to do the job, or they were not willing to uphold ethical standards, or if they didn't care about innocence, they would go to the door. And I don't, it was nothing I enjoyed even a little bit. It caused me a lot of angst for a long time as we carefully figured out who that had to be and even cut a break to some other people who later made their way out the door anyway. But I think it was important to show that we meant business.
I took office, I was inaugurated January 2nd of this year, went into the office January 3rd. We had 5 homicides in January, we had 4 in February, and an officer-involved shooting. So we were busy for Boston in the beginning. I was working on my policy memo. One of the things that I remember seeing that Larry did was issue this sort of mandate that was just so beautiful in its simplicity and straightforwardness of you shall X, and whatever the 25, 30 things were. I wanted to make sure that, I had something that was sort of my vision board of what I thought criminal justice system could be. And it was more of a culture document for my office so they could learn a little bit more about me. So with Larry's beautiful simplicity came my 66-page memo. But excuse me, we had data and we had pictures. Really nice pictures of brown people not committing crimes, right? I mean, so anyways, it was important that we put this out, and then we started slowly but surely making it very clear that this is what the office was going to be. And a lot of people opted out, and I'm okay with that, in the sense of if I say we're going to treat people with dignity and respect, we're going to have an office that fully reflects Suffolk County, and we're going to look at racial and wealth-based disparities, and 30 people say they'd like to leave, I think that's a great day.
So I guess the first thing I did was made a decision about 12 people that they would not be back, and some of them were based on court opinions where they had intentionally withheld and kind of tricked the court about evidence. Some of those had to go. There were people that I had personally dealt with on cases where I knew that they had hidden evidence and lied about it, and the prior administration wouldn't do anything about it, so they were automatically gone. And then there were others who had been there and just weren't going to share the same vision. It was only a total of 12. I had a different situation, and having been a judge there for 22 years, I knew most of the lawyers in the DA's office, and I knew them to be fine people. And because I had a very spirited primary campaign and a general election campaign, I had put together a platform of things that I promised to do within 90 days of taking office. And so when I took office, it was putting those things together and writing them out and putting them in a way, not 66 pages, but more along the lines of what Larry did. In fact, that was my model for doing it, was what Larry did. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Larry.
Yeah, you've had bigger impact than you know, buddy.
Tell your family that.
I want you to know I stole it too.
Yeah. And so we put those policies out, and the interesting thing was the policies weren't radical. They were just consistent with modern criminal justice. And the other thing that's interesting about the staff was most of that staff is younger people. When we're talking about not prosecuting marijuana, first-time marijuana cases, and putting everybody else in a non-criminal justice setting, that is more of a public health setting, they understand that. I tried to tell the police chiefs, do you think these kids haven't smoked marijuana? You think they don't have friends who smoke marijuana? I mean, come on, guys. Just because you haven't doesn't mean the rest of the world hasn't. And so, you know, that was kind of controversial, and we did those things. But just getting there, like I said, just getting it done and getting the proposals out took a lot of my time the first 3 months, getting it right. But had a lot of staff buy-in, and I think it's been good with the staff since then.
Can I just make one comment? So I do think there are gender issues afoot, though, here as well, and race, as usual. So for me, coming in, when I ran, you know, I was sort of put out there as this very in a positive way, like a passionate black woman who blah, blah, blah. But what the real undertone was like, she's a very aggressive black woman who's going to come in and fire everyone, and it's going to be like Black Panther, right? Wakanda when I show up. So for me, it was intentional that I'm going to give, everyone starts with an A+, and you work your way down from there. And so I have, in previous jobs, had to fire many, many people. This was not my first time leading. It was my first time being the leader, not being a leader in a C-suite of like 18,000 person state agency. But it was intentional that I not come in there and terminate people because I wanted to give people an opportunity. But I also recognize that when women do that, it's seen differently oftentimes as our male counterparts.
Thanks for that. I'm going to veer off a little and ask you, because you raised it, if you are noticing a pattern in the discourse around women of color who have recently been elected and the pushback they're getting as compared to the pushback that maybe their white or white male counterparts have or haven't received.
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, we look at Kim Gardner, we look at Kim Fox, we look at me, for example, where, you know, in Boston, I have had a Secretary of Public Safety who's appointed by our governor write a letter, not a lawyer, he's a probation officer by trade, that he sent to the media before sending to me, and the governor, you know, either approved, obviously. We've had the National Police Patrolmen's Association sue me or file a BBO complaint. Where's my lawyer? Judge Gertner, are you in here? She's amazing. I love you. Okay, anyways. But my point is prior to me even taking office, there was a national police organization that filed a BBO complaint. You know, ICE has made statements about us. We sued ICE recently. I'm one of 2 DAs that did that. And then there's 11 DAs in Massachusetts. The district attorney of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, which for the people who don't know what that is, if you've seen Caddyshack, remember Judge Smales when he was in his boat? Like, that's where, I love Caddyshack. Cheers to you guys too. But anyways, it's the whitest place in the world, and then cube it, and then add $3 million for every home that's there. And he's telling me how to run an urban DA's office. He has 60 employees. I have over 300, you know. So it's very interesting how people feel really comfortable speaking to people who are actually from the community that you prosecute every day and have no problem parting their lips to say, like, let me tell you about all of your people and what jail's really like when you've never been there, or, you know, don't know us and aren't us. Love speaking for and about us, but not asking us to sit at the table.
Wow. Do either of you have anything to add on that?
Oh, I think what I read and see across the United States, obviously that's true. And let's be honest, race and sex matter in the United States, okay? And when you have women of color and women who have beliefs and they're willing to express their beliefs and stick with their beliefs and implement their beliefs, that is going to offend a certain population. And when we look across law enforcement, not every law enforcement agent or agency, but they're mostly white males. That's just the way it is. And they're very conservative. And they believe in the power of handcuffs, and they believe in the power of jail, and they refuse to acknowledge anything that will reduce crime. They think that arresting people and putting them in jail reduces crime, when we know that that's not true. It often creates crime. They have no understanding of risk needs assessments. They have no understanding of substance abuse. And so when you, mental health, yeah, they say they do, but I can tell you from, and I can't go into the details, but you know, I get to see every police shooting in Dallas County now, the shooting and the death. And I get to see what happens. And when I hear somebody say that I've got a well-trained police force in reference to mental health issues, and I see a mentally ill person get blown up, you know, with 100 shots at them, and see how it was handled, you know, your rhetoric and your practice are two different things. And, you know, so I understand what and see what she's going through, and I see what the others are going through around the country. And like I said, race and sex matter. And when you're talking about the individuals who are running these entities, I don't know whether they realize what they're doing or not. Their beliefs are just so ingrained and they're so reflexive. And what we're seeing now, let's be honest, and I think Larry is seeing it too, is across the nation, we're seeing a pushback on progressive prosecution. We're seeing a police pushback. We're seeing a political pushback. The governor of, and I don't want to change the tone of the question, but the governor of the state of Texas called me a socialist. And I thought, that's pretty damn good. You know, why don't you focus on paying the teachers a little bit more and taking care of kindergarten and things like that, instead of this nonsense about I'm a socialist. So you get pushback from every direction, and so I see it, and yes, I believe that it's a problem for them.
We've just seen that Aramis Ayala has decided not to run again, and there does seem to be an ongoing cycle of increasingly negative discourse,
Yes.
in particular for women of color. Are you going to add something?
Yeah, I think I would be remiss if I did not point out that our colleague Marilyn Mosby, who's the chief prosecutor in Baltimore, is here. She's sitting up there, and now she's waving. Hi, Marilyn.
From Boston originally. From Boston originally.
And I believe Marilyn is another example of someone who's done some really courageous stuff, and who has been the victim of unfair treatment by the press and a lot of the police accountability things she's done and other things she's done. But here's the news. Marilyn got reelected, and even if Aramis is not running again, I would stay tuned on that one. I would stay tuned and see what it is that Aramis might be doing next. Or if you see that George Gascon in San Francisco is not running again for district attorney of San Francisco, where he's done so many remarkable things, I would stay tuned on that one too, because what we're actually seeing is not that all of these progressive DAs are getting knocked out of the box. What we're seeing is victories in Virginia, for heaven's sakes, 2 of them, and recently, and I think to the extent we are seeing progressive prosecutors who may not be running again, there could be some good reasons for that.
It's an exciting time, unquestionably. Thinking about, before we get into the operational questions that you all are struggling with now, you mentioned DA Krasner, mission, and DA Rollins, you mentioned vision. Bearing in mind that a mission statement, I think, is ideally 15 words or less, what do you see?
It's not 66 pages. I'm sorry.
With pictures. What do you each see as the mission of your office?
Man, okay. So the oath of a prosecutor is to seek justice. It is a different ethical obligation than, for example, I had as a criminal defense attorney, where the obligation was essentially to zealously represent your client without breaking any laws or any ethical rules. To me, the mission should be to do what the oath is, and that is to seek justice, which I think means to tell the truth all the time. I think it means to define justice as broadly as the entire jurisdiction. In other words, it's not just the people in the courtroom. They are, of course, extremely important. It's also the little girl in public school who doesn't have the resources that she needs to become all she can be. It's all the young men who are in much greater danger of being involved in criminal activity because they don't have the resources that they need. And I think, I think if we add to those two things, that our thinking has to be deeply rooted in a sense of equality, that's probably a pretty good mission.
Yeah, I would say, I want my office to understand that we represent the Commonwealth and that the Commonwealth includes the defendant and people, like Larry said, outside of this, the courtroom that we're dealing with, and that we have an obligation to explain the process to people, because there are many people that don't have any understanding of what's happening when they come into a courtroom. It is also an obligation to make sure that we are reflective of who we serve. So I want you to understand that in the language that you speak fluently. I think if we have the ability to take away your liberty, you shouldn't understand 72% of what's happening, and even if we take away your liberty for 30 days. And I also find it, this is not in my mission statement, but important to stay. This is why it was 66 pages, you see this, right? Is that, I find it fascinating when my peers now, prosecutors, have no problem throwing out numbers about what we're going to sentence people to. They've never set foot in a prison. They've never spent a day themselves in jail. So one of the things that I love reminding them is, yes, I'm a prosecutor. Yes, I won very well, by the way. But I have 2 siblings that are incarcerated. I make sure that I go to a jail once a month myself, and not the close ones, and they're going to start doing it too, because we represent the community and we are duty bound to them.
So I think seeking justice is fairly common across the United States, but what does it really mean? When I was a practicing prosecutor many years ago, one of the judges who I practiced in front of made a statement to me that's had a lifelong impact on me. And that is, when you send a person to prison, you send his or her family to prison with them. And even as a young man, that's stuck with me. And so I have had this vision of justice that includes all of the community, all of the family, and all of the neighborhood, and those types of things. And that's why I have focused so much on effective dispositions of cases. And that is reducing recidivism and reducing cost, and giving the person an opportunity to go on with a life, or to capture, and I don't mean recapture, sometimes it's capture a life that they never had. And I have put people, this is my own little deal, into 2 categories: those you can rehabilitate and those that need habilitation. Because there are many, many people out here who have never had a chance. You know who they are. If you're in criminal justice, you look at them and go, oh my God, how is that person still alive? And those are the people who never had a chance. And so what I'm trying to do is to create an atmosphere in the district attorney's office where we understand that, and that we stop locking people up just over and over and over, because they too become institutionalized, and they too come down there just to get more time. And so back when I was a judge, I had a program where I just rejected plea bargain agreements for these continual felons and force them to go into treatment. You say, well, you can't force somebody. Yes, you can, okay? And they tell me, I have my plea bargain. I said, well, I'm not signing it. So you don't really have a plea bargain. You go into treatment. And it worked quite well. And so it's become a model. It's what I use to talk to the prosecutors today about the possibility of redemption and the possibility of habilitation. And it's even come to the point where we get sticking points between judges and defendants and their lawyers, where I've had to physically go down to the courtroom and sit next to, as the elected district attorney, sit next to the defendant and say, okay, what's the problem? Why are we doing this one more time? When are we going to stop? When are we going to give you a life? And why am I, the elected district attorney, seated next to you physically, as closer than she and I are? And what is it that we need to do? And so it's a whole different way of looking at criminal justice. It's a way of looking at a life, not a case. It's a way of improving the quality of life in a community for those who we otherwise have given up on. And when we talk about rehabilitation, it's reclaiming a life that has gone awry. And that's the easier one, of course, because they have a foundation. We just need to get the foundation back. The hardest one is where they never had a foundation. So that thing about doing justice is just multifaceted to me and just exciting. It really is when you can reclaim one of those lives. That's really justice and really matters to me.
As you think about implementing the kind of culture change that's consistent with the visions you've all articulated, have you changed your internal metrics and how you're promoting people and how you're rewarding people internally, or are you thinking about that, and what are you imagining an ideal performance review of a line ADA will ultimately look like in a progressive prosecutor's office?
So that's kind of a great question, which doesn't mean I have an answer. No, I have a little bit of an answer. So, metrics as a separate issue, I think, are extremely important, because the reality is when we talk about criminal justice, the way it is considered in society, it is extremely different than, for example, medicine. With medicine, we all kind of accept the notion that science matters, facts matter, tendencies, trends matter. We talk about oncologists as if they're good oncologists, even if some people sometimes die. It's a measure of how you manage a difficult thing. It's not what we have with criminal justice. What you have with criminal justice is, let's give a one-off story about a terrible crime in which something awful truly happened to somebody else, and let's pretend that that one-off story actually reflects a much broader trend. Let's pretend that tells us whether violent crime is up or down, recidivism is up or down, whether crime is being managed well, for example, in the city of Chicago. These are different worlds, and in my opinion, the only way that progressive prosecutors are going to succeed is if they can defeat that narrative, which means they need science. They actually need to have metrics for everything they're doing, including for how they evaluate the prosecutors. How do you apply that here? Well, let me just give you an example of how powerful the metrics are, and then we can talk about how it applies to an individual prosecutor. So my office, with the help of Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which gave us 2 fellows for a couple years, at the beginning of our term, over the last 18 months, has gathered data, and we have been looking at one particular piece of data, which is what is the number of future years of incarceration that are generated during a particular period of time by the courts. So over, let's just say quarterly, over a 3-month period, how many years of future incarceration are coming out of the courts? In other words, are we reducing future mass incarceration or are we not? And then we did the same thing with supervision, meaning probation and parole. Are we increasing the lengths of these periods of supervision or are we decreasing them? And what we found, for example, is comparing the last quarter of 2014 to the last quarter of 2018, that we're generating about half as many years of incarceration, maybe a third as many years of supervision through some very specific policies that we have. The dollar value of going from, and I actually have the statistics with me because I'm so excited about it, but the dollar value of going from 3,144 years of future incarceration to 1,711 years of future incarceration is a savings of approximately $86 million per quarter, okay? If you start to analyze that over the period of a 4-year term, you're looking at $1.36 billion. And that's just the dollar side of just the incarceration. You start adding in supervision, which has gone from 11,000 plus to 5,000 plus. You quickly find yourself in an amazing amount of money that's being saved in the process. Not that money's the point, money's not the point, but money is resources going to public education, to treatment, to mental health, to other things that prevent this. So how does this then apply to your prosecutors? Well, one of the things you can look at if you have the metrics is how many years of future incarceration is this prosecutor generating as compared to their peers in the homicide unit or in this other unit? How are we doing with the actual recidivism of the people they touch? And that's where we'd like to get. Because in many ways, what prosecutors are doing is they're managing risk. Every insurance company knows how to evaluate the management of risk. Why don't we? Why don't we look at the prosecutors who seem to have good judgment about which people deserve a second and third chance and which don't? And why don't we look to see which ones of them do it well? That's not what we do. I mean, the traditional metric is, what's your win rate? Did you get more time? than anybody else? Are you making your boss feel good because you're from the same neighborhood? I mean, that's really how this has been done. A lot of it's been done very subjectively on feeling comfortable because this person you supervise is a lot like you, and how much of a hard ass are you? That's been the metric. So we are trying to get there, but you know, the aspect we haven't hit yet, and it's going to take us a while to get to, is how do you measure the wisdom of the management of risk in your prosecutors?
So for me, all that, plus I would say we look at community engagement. We also look at creative outcomes. So one of the things we're proud of is when victims come forward and all we do is tell them, you know, if found guilty, the individual is going to get this much time, as opposed to we can null pros this, we can divert this pre-arraignment, we can arraign them and then try to do some diversion post-arraignment, or we can do a restorative justice piece if that's what you're interested in, but giving them more power to decide what it is that they want. I know it takes more time, but we are going to look at that a little bit differently. And then one of the things, I don't just do performance reviews for my staff. We have to realize, so 500 employees, 300 employees, a budget of a little over $20 million, 35,000 cases a year. I have tons of contracts that my office gives out. And my predecessor lived in those neighborhoods, Larry, that I don't know what the equivalent of your West Roxbury is, but it's probably one of the more wealthy parts of Boston. And all of our 28 or 30 cars are serviced in West Roxbury. All of the food we order for anything in our office comes out of Roach Brothers, which is in West Roxbury. And they are great mechanics, and that's yummy snack foods. But Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan is where all of our homicides happen. Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, Chelsea, and Jamaica Plain are where all of our violent crimes happen. So why am I not putting money into those communities? Why am I not finding a mechanic that can service our 28 cars in the very community we over-prosecute or over-police, as that community believes? Why aren't we doing positive things there and ordering our food from women-owned business, minority-owned business, disadvantaged businesses in the communities most impacted by our decisions? That's bucket number 2. Bucket number 3, which very few other people in the country have this, in Massachusetts, the district attorneys direct and control all homicides, from death to sentencing. So everyone else jumps in post-arrest, but the police in Massachusetts cannot make an arrest on a homicide without the district attorney saying, we authorize that arrest. So I have the Boston Police Homicide Unit. I don't hire and fire them, but they can't come into the unit without me saying yay or nay. And the same thing for the narcotics unit for the state police and the homicide unit for the state police. So I'm looking at every person that comes in there and asking them a series of questions and saying, ultimately, I can't fire you, but you will not be in this unit unless you are willing to understand what it is I'm going to demand of you as the district attorney here.
Well, so I came in and said, just trying to get a grip on what was going on and what was happening. One of the major things that was a concern of mine and to those who were still there, and this is not necessarily progressive in a way, but it's just functioning, is that our prosecutors in the misdemeanor section, which you need to get through that to get to the felony section, weren't trying any cases. And we were promoting people to felony courts with 3 and 4 trials. And the reason they weren't going to trial didn't have anything to do with them. It had to do with the judges. And the judges weren't going to trial. So it's pretty hard when you're going to ask somebody to try a murder case and they only tried 4 cases. That's almost impossible. And I came up in an era where we tried cases and cases. And so when I looked across the landscape, that was like impossible. That was like looking at Mars to me. I couldn't even understand what I was looking at. And so one of the first things I did was went down and tried to talk to the prosecutors individually and as a group about trying cases. And then I went to the judges about what we need to do to try cases, because I can't evaluate the quality of their work if they don't try cases. And you all, and this was true, the judges and the defense lawyers were complaining to me about the lack of skill sets on various and sundry things about the lawyers in the office. Well, that's fine. That's good. Guess what? If they don't try cases, they'll never get the skills. So what we've seen is an uptick in that. So that's one thing we've looked at, not whether they win the cases or whatever, but whether they go to trial. The other thing is that we have looked at some specific areas, mental health and substance abuse, and we have put together a different team of individuals, some of the same people, but we had some people there who had no business being there. They were just put there to fill a spot, but they were making some very poor decisions and clogging up the pipeline and causing mentally ill and homeless people to be in jail when they could have been out in the community receiving services. And that's very expensive, and it's very immoral as far as I'm concerned. And so we got rid of those people, and we put some new people in, and now we have a better flow. We've gone back and reevaluated those cases to look at the ones who don't need to be there. We're now getting people out of jail and getting them back into the community. So one of the things I did, since they were doing such a good job, we actually had some extra money laying around that we could give bonuses for. I gave all of them a bonus, every single one of them, because they were doing such a good job. The other thing is our intake section. People don't realize we're 10,000 cases behind. We have a 10,000 case backlog in our intake section. And that's because this mindless just accepting of cases, even these misdemeanor marijuana cases, some felony cases, just taking them and they just backlog, and you never get caught up. It's just kind of stupid. So that staff came up with some ideas on how to reduce the backlog and some things we could do better with the police agencies and what have you. So guess what? I gave them a bonus. They'd never gotten a bonus before. Nobody ever gave a damn about a 10,000 case backlog. In fact, when I told some of the judges who had worked in the DA's office, they accused me of creating a backlog. And I've just been in office since January 1, so obviously I didn't do that. And so anyway, I told them, no, we're now focused on numbers and outcomes and being effective. So we're in the process of doing some studies on implicit bias in the DA's office. We have some numbers that are coming out about marijuana cases. We know what the police do, but what do we do? And so rather than doing a training on implicit bias, what I've decided to do, and this is from my drug court days and how to get somebody to do something that they don't really want to do, right? So what I've done is not said anything about it, but I'm going to present the numbers and then do the training so that they get the training with the benefit of not just, he's just throwing this out at us, but that, wait a minute, there's something wrong with what we've done. And I think if I do it that way, it'll have a better impact, and maybe they'll slow down and change their behavior, and then we'll be able to measure that on an ongoing basis. So there are a lot of things in the DA's office, and I don't have time to go into all the sections, but where we've never looked at what's going on and what's the outcome and what can we do better. Civil asset forfeiture is one. That's one of my next topics that, next areas that I'm going to tackle.
This question about the primacy of trial experience is such a thorny one in DA's offices.
Yes.
Because, of course, you don't want to disincentivize seeking appropriate pretrial dispositions, but still there is a sense that prosecutors need to have the trial experience to handle the most egregious cases. One thing we're interested in at the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution is the kind of user experience of folks who go through the system in all of the different ways that people do. And we know that it is very often the same community members who come in as crime survivors, as witnesses, and later as people who are charged with crimes. We've just posted a procedural justice for prosecutors curriculum that is a resource to any prosecutors in the room who are interested. But something I wonder about is whether any of you have thought about measuring user experience and the faith that community members do or don't have in the integrity of the system, whether from their vantage point as a survivor or as someone who is charged.
Short answer, yes. Have we done it? No. Do we intend to? Yes. I mean, if you look, for example, at what was done in Alameda County, also known as Oakland, with their juvenile restorative justice program, it's pretty compelling. What they did is they took juveniles, even ones who had committed pretty serious offenses like burglaries, things like that. They put them in a room with the victim, worked out a sort of a contract whereby the juvenile would have to do certain things to make it up to the victim through a restorative process. And then they polled victims to see how they felt in that experience as compared to the one that I used to see all the time when, as an active trial lawyer in juvenile court, which usually involves a victim coming to court 2 or 3 times, being kind of frustrated when things don't happen, and then often without the victim ever making it into a courtroom, the case is resolved, and some very young prosecutor is bragging about how the kid's being sent off to an institution, right? And what they found was that the victims were much happier with this restorative process, with the face-to-face meeting, with being able to express what had happened to them, but also hearing from the defendant what were the circumstances that brought this kid to that spot. And then, of course, the continuing engagement in which there was accountability and there was activity on the part of the juvenile, which was restorative to both of them. And by the way, recidivism went way down too. So I do think it's extremely important to be able to shatter this false notion that what all victims want is the most retributive, punitive thing. What all victims want is the severed arm for a theft, and what they all want is the death penalty for any sort of a homicide case. It's really not true, and to the extent that we are once again able to do that scary thing, which is resort to facts and science, I know not necessarily popular in our federal government these days, but to the extent we can go to facts and science, we can actually show that there are much better ways to do things.
Yeah, we so Court Watch is really great in that they've, with the ACLU's What a Difference a DA Makes campaign, Court Watch is now in the court watching, that's the name, you get it, right? Watching everything that's happening, and then on social media explaining it. I agree with Larry about some of those proposals. One of the things we're trying to do, and just started, we're going to be announcing shortly, is like, what I get exhausted about is when DAs say, yeah, that's not our problem, right? Like we're the catch basin at the end, and all these failures we don't need to talk about. It's not our problem. Where I think we can be better is we have victim witness advocates, all of us. We're going to now have a survivor services where, in a perfect world, right, the victim witness advocates are helping explain the process. But when a homicide happens and you have to now take in your son or nephew's 3 children, how do you work with the Department of Children and Families? If you aren't, wealthy when this homicide happens and you have a Section 8 voucher and you don't want to walk into this over the same threshold where you saw your loved one's body there and there's still blood stains, how do you have your voucher moved somewhere else? The victim witness advocates aren't set up to do that. So I think we're going to make the user experience better by actually providing guidance throughout the process and help. And if we can force all of these state agencies that are allegedly there to help people, but you're sitting on hold for 17 hours or nobody calls you back, we're gonna try to make the user experience better that way, and then proactively moving away from violent crimes and homicide toward the door of the courtroom to say, like, do we have greeters, right? I'm not saying we're Target, but we need to be better at having people understand what the hell happens when you walk into court and where you're supposed to go and what the process is.
The Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice here has just completed a study that's not yet published about the perceptions of frontline criminal justice workers around procedural justice. And it does seem to also increase job satisfaction of frontline workers when there is a feeling that those best practices in procedural justice, understanding the process, et cetera, connecting in a meaningful way with users of the system, that actually does elevate people's sense of their job. And that dovetails with the next question, which is, do you each have a theory around recruiting and retention, and how are you going about exacting your vision through those tools?
Well, so the interesting thing in my few months in office is that we've had people leave other district attorneys' offices in the state, and not just contiguous counties, but from across the state, to come be a part of a progressive DA's office. And they want to be a part of that change in conversation, and they want to see a change in how criminal justice is practiced and how it's implemented in the community. So that's been very refreshing. We'll see where it goes. We're watching and paying attention to what they do. in accord to some of the things that we're saying, we're doing some of the same things and trying to make it a better experience for not only the victims and the witnesses, but for the assistant DAs, that they get more meaning out of that. And I think what's going to happen is as we develop data about what we're doing and outcomes, that we'll get a better experience for them and a better feeling for what they do.
We're professionalizing our office, right? Like, so having worked at a large firm, you started the first day at then the firm Bingham McCutcheon, and it was like trumpets and a red carpet and roses were thrown out, and we had lunch all the time. At the DA's office, it's like people start and they don't even know where they're sitting. This is not under my administration, but I think we don't onboard well. We don't have a great training program. We're changing all of that. In addition,
Bringing out the trumpets.
well, we will have some trumpets, probably, yeah. But yeah, no roses, right? But my thing is just, I think we have to be better at our training piece. I think we had a record number of amazing interns that just started in our office. We're getting people from schools that we normally wouldn't have, some historically black colleges and Ivy League schools as well. Anyone from Boston, like everyone is from Suffolk University that comes to the DA's office. It's, you know, a quarter of a mile from our headquarters, but we're now expanding that. And the retention piece is important in that we need to talk to people about what their goals are, right? When I was on the hiring committee at my firm and at the U.S. Attorney's Office, the answer used to be like, where do you see yourself in 10 years? It's like working for you, doing the same job. I like people who want to, you know, work really hard for 2 to 3 years and then decide what they're going to do next. You know, I wouldn't want to hear that you're going to be here for 6 months, but I do think we have to look at training people and then giving them different opportunities. The retention piece, though, I want to be actively involved in helping them either stay or find somewhere else when they're ready to go.
So this is, to me, this is a super exciting topic, and maybe the most important one, at least for someone, you know, my age, and I'm 58, we're not going to finish this process while I'm DA in Philadelphia County. Most of these really important civil rights, criminal justice type arcs are going to take 30 years. I'm not sure what year we're in, but it ain't year 30. So the people who are going to finish this mission are going to be people we hire. Maybe not for you, Rachel, you're a little younger than me, but for me, it's going to be people we hire. So we made this a huge priority last year. There were a lot of things we wanted. We didn't want to just be a Homer school. We wanted a higher level of diversity. Our attorney diversity was only 20% in a city where there are a total of 40% white people, okay? That ain't cool. So we had to do something about it. Specifically, what we did is we spent a couple of solid months after talking to some students. We realized that if we simply said, okay, we're going to go to, you know, top 20 rated schools plus the local schools, plus we're going to go to all the HBU law schools that remain, that wouldn't be good enough, because what they would hear is, oh, some district attorney is coming. That means some right-wing, punitive, retributive jackass is coming, and I want to be a public defender. I don't want to be that. Or I want to work in social justice in a nonprofit. I don't want to be that. So what we had to do was a roadshow. I and my two first assistants had to go school by school and speak at those schools. So that we didn't just get the applicants who've been watching the worst television show in America, Law and Order, their entire lives. We got the ones who have always said, I want to be a public defender, but if I could be a public defender with power, or if I could be a prosecutor with compassion, maybe that's more like what I want to be, right? So we did the roadshow, and these are the results. And I hesitate to say it in front of both of you because
I'm stealing all your people.
I hear you. But let me also say this. After I disclose it to you, I would like to think that when I go somewhere and I say, look, not everybody's going to want to come to Philly. I do. You may not. But let me tell you who you should go see in Boston. And let me tell you who you should go see in Dallas and in these various other cities. I mean, I really think that we should be recruiting for each other because we are a different team than the old team, right? What were the results? The results were we went to schools like Washington University in St. Louis, Vanderbilt, where we hired 4 or 5 people for the first time in the history of an office that has never hired anyone from those schools. We had applicants from absolutely, you know, top-rated Ivy League institutions, and our diversity ended up like this. Out of a new class of 62, huge class, 62 attorneys starting in September, We have 49% diverse. If you do not count orientation, if you count orientation, it is 56%. And this is landing on top of an office that was 20% diverse. So will it make a difference? It will make a difference.
That's awesome.
It's a question for this new team that you're talking about, DA Krasner. So many folks are starting to do the meaningful but hard work of diverting low-level cases, getting the cases out of the system that shouldn't be touching the system to begin with. What are we going to do with violent crime? And what would a really creative, meaningful response to violent crime look like in this country?
So, needless to say, probably everybody here is aware that it does not solve the problem of mass incarceration to let those fictional people who are doing 50 years for marijuana possession out of jail. That is no longer the case. That does not go on anymore. The real source of mass incarceration in the United States, as confirmed in John Pfaff's book, Locked In, and various other sources, is crimes that we categorize as violent, okay? So, one obvious thing you got to do is you got to figure out whether our sentences make sense. And they don't. Let me give you an example. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, if you got a sentence of life without the possibility of parole in Pennsylvania, the amount of time you actually did was on average about 16 or 17 years, because there was commutation. There were these other methods that were used, and they were used all the time to convert those sentences into something else. People pled guilty to life without the possibility of parole with the expectation of that kind of a sentence, and everybody thought that that was okay at that time. Another example, if you look at what happened in Pennsylvania and compare it to the nation, Pennsylvania experienced an 800% increase in incarceration. The nation experienced a 500% increase in incarceration since the late 1970s. Well, in some of our analyses, looking at the sentences for what we call violent crimes, what we've also seen is that 5 is the new 1. In other words, look at the period of time before all your mandatory sentences kicked in and your sentencing guidelines got out of control in your state. And yes, this is mostly about states, because 93% of criminal cases are disposed in the state. And what you will see is there came a moment when all of a sudden a 1-year sentence was called a 5-year sentence, and a 5-year sentence was called a 25-year sentence. I mean, in Pennsylvania, there came a moment when they started to double all the maximums for lower levels of homicide. 5 is the new 1. I mean, that's really what has happened. It's simple to say, but we are going to have to rein in some of these sentences. There is a really big difference between 2 union guys who get in a fight in a bar, and one of them knocks out the other one's tooth. And we call that a violent offense. Or 2 kids having a fight in a schoolyard. One of them gets a black eye, which never would have made the criminal justice system at all when I was in public school, and we call that a violent offense. There's a big difference between that and somebody who is causing paralysis by shooting somebody else, all right? So we're going to have to break down the notion of what we really consider to be the kind of violent crime that tears apart society, as opposed to the kind of crime that is in no way worthy of these lengthy sentences. And then we're also going to have to look at whether the sentence in a particular case needs to be 50 years, or maybe 5 is the new 1. It really needs to be 10, because it does make a tremendous difference. Needless to say, there are many other ways to get at this. It is not written in stone that the people who are most dangerous should get the least services. How does that make any sense? If you go to Germany, what you'll find out is they view the purpose of incarceration as being, number 1, the incarceration is to separate you from society. That is the punishment. And number 2, the purpose is to get you back into society. So if, for example, you are an immigrant, and there are many immigrants in jail in Germany, they will not just give you language classes in German, level 1, 2, 3. They will pay you to take those language classes in German 1, 2, 3, because they know that you're going to go work instead of taking those classes if they don't pay you. And they know that if you come out of jail incapable of interacting in the German language in Germany, that your chances of ending up back in crime are higher. There are so many ways to get at this, but fundamentally, we're going to have to adjust our incredibly retributive and draconian way of dealing with violent crime.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I don't know what's happening. I think we should also, in Boston, we're looking at young people that are caught with a gun but have not discharged the gun. Are we diverting serious diversion with respect to some of those cases as opposed to sending them away. I think you're right. It is a really tough conversation because there are some people that already think my list of 15 crimes that in the first instance we aren't going to prosecute, we would look at the bucket of mental health, substance use disorder, or poverty. If that's why you're caught up in our system, let's go to the root cause there. If we then say something like what Larry's saying, which we will, I've completely gone off the reservation with respect to that in their eyes. But I do think we have to start doing the things he's talking about and then looking at some of the gun crimes, because I think in Massachusetts, we look at everyone that has a gun the exact same way. And with young people, I don't know what's happening. With young people, I think that there are buckets of individuals as to why they have them. And whether it's, I just saw my brother or cousin or best friend murdered, I'm 14 years old, or I was just beaten up and I have a gun, they're never going to use that gun. They have it for there. And there are 5 or 6 buckets. And then at the end, there's the person who has a gun, and they're known to us for having 5 or 6 bodies on them. Those are 2 very different people. We treat them exactly the same in the process.
So I want to just change what Larry said. I want to agree with everything he said and agree with everything that has been said, but use it in a different way, and that is we have over-incarcerated America. Let's be honest. We have made more things illegal, and we have put more time on things that we've made illegal with the idea that that was going to make us safer. And it didn't make us safer, and it cost us a hell of a lot of more money. And so how do we undo the over-incarceration of America? And one of the things that Larry talked about is risk. He's talked about it a couple of times. And when we look at the fact that a person has committed a certain offense does not necessarily mean that they're at risk of doing it again or doing anything else. And so we have risk assessments and we have needs assessments. And I know that there's some controversy about that along the lines of race, but it's better than a guess, in my opinion. And so one of the programs that I did when I was a judge was this reentry program with these people who continually come through. Let me tell you, some of them were aggravated robberies, aggravated assaults, and those types of cases. And some of them were repeat offenders for the same offense, and put them on probation anyway, and put them into treatment, and brought them back, and stuck with them, and stayed with them on Friday mornings for 2 hours, and had specialized probation officers and specialized treatment programs for them. And we had a 33% reduction in recidivism. And we had a 40-something% reduction in technical violations of probation. So this idea that a particular crime should equal an amount of time and a harsh amount of time is just a false premise. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And if we rethink what we're doing, and another thing Larry said is we should put more resources on the high-risk people. Those are the people that we throw away, and we stupidly put resources on low-risk people who need us to leave them alone, right? The more we fool with them, the more likely it is that they're going to do something of a nature that's going to offend us, and we wind up putting them back in jail and maybe in prison. And so making a distinction between low, medium, and high risk is very important, and putting our resources on the high-risk individuals in a manner that's conducive to them going from being high risk to low risk. It's just like high blood pressure. When you go to the doctor, you have high blood pressure, you're at a risk for a whole lot of bad stuff, okay? And the doctor's goal is to do what? Reduce your blood pressure so that your risk for all that bad stuff happening goes down. It's the same thing in criminal justice. And until we recognize that and put that into operation, we're going to continue to over-incarcerate America.
I've been told that the judge wants me to questions, so as a prosecutor, I feel compelled to do what the judge has asked. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I wanted to ask about perhaps how you all might. Hello. I wanted to ask to find out, as DAs, do you see yourself, or have you gone to lawmakers to talk about what you think about sentencing policy? I thought this discussion around sentences are too long, and obviously you have thoughts about it, and are you taking that to the lawmakers to try and change it?
Let me jump on that. Yes, and have been doing it for quite some time. In fact, so back in the early 90s when Ann Richards appointed as judge, we had a thing called the Punishment Standards Commission, and we redid a lot of sentences. And it all got messed up when George Bush got to be the governor. He did some other things. But I continued along that path, and even up until this last legislative session, which is every 2 years for 140 days. So it's like all hell breaks out for 140 days and trying to get something done. But we have continued to talk about that, to talk about how what sentencing policy should be and how to reduce crime by changing some of the sentences, or at least the process by which a person is sentenced. We've continued to do that in Texas.
Short answer, yes. You know, in Pennsylvania, we're up against what I think a lot of progressive prosecutors are up against, which is that the state legislatures, especially those that have large swaths of rural or suburban demographics, are not with us. So we're maybe another election cycle or two away, if things go well, from being in a position to actually get it done. This is part of the reason, though, that I believe progressive prosecutors are so important, because they have all of this discretion. And within their jurisdiction, they can become the experiment for the state to see about what actually happens when you try these innovative policies. You know, it's a kind of a sort of a local statewide federalism, you might say. And that, I think, is part of what we all stand for, is we stand for the example, the experiment, the scientifically vetted approach. And to the extent that we are successful and we can tell that story successfully, it will be persuasive to the legislature.
Yeah, we definitely do. I also testify on other things outside of what people think my lane is. So I went up and testified on an education bill that was going to actually fund urban and poor, overwhelmingly minority school districts, and said you can put in $18,000 per student here on hope and promise and dreams and education and future, or which you are grappling with, but you have no problem $55,000 a year to send somebody to the Suffolk County House of Corrections at the back end. And if we fail them educationally, that is a very strong indicator that we're going to get them back here. Let's do that. And I think we can be powerful voices as DAs, not only in sentencing, which people expect, but in areas like housing, environmental issues, education, of course, mental health, access to things like that. We need to be vocal because they are all impacting us.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm a defense attorney, and so I want to ask a question about the victims' rights movement, which we all agree with. Can you hear me? So my question is this. There's a narrative that it is cathartic for victims to vent at sentencings, and those of us as defense attorneys see it all the time. That narrative is encouraged by victim witness advocates all the time. And what happens at sentencing, a lot of times, it turns into a mini Jerry Springer show. In my judgment, that is not beneficial for the defendant, but it's not beneficial for the victim either. And so I want to know if you believe that to be accurate, and what you're doing to encourage your victim witness advocates to bring into play all of the potential for sentencing, not only that will help them, but will help the defendant, because most of these defendants do ultimately get out of jail or prison, and we try to bring them back into society. But I think the sentencing process under those circumstances is not positive for anyone. That's my assessment.
Let me real quickly say that in the state of Texas, that is allowed after the sentence, not before. Okay. Personally, we may disagree on this, but I think it's a good thing to have a say as long as it's controlled, and I think that's up to the judge and the prosecutor to make certain that what they say is appropriate. I agree with you that I don't necessarily know that it does anything for the defendant, but at that point, that case is over. The person's been sentenced. And in Texas, we did have a judge who, after hearing all of this, changed the sentence upward, of course, and that was quickly reversed, and the original sentence was put back in place.
Thank you. Do I have a question in the center? Judge Adams?
Yes. Can you hear me? All right. Good afternoon. I just wanted first to say to the panel, I'm very impressed, and I have it on speaker. Testing. Hello? All right. Sitting back too far. I wanted to first say to the panel, I'm very impressed and feel some sense of hope by the job that you all are doing. Congratulations on your respective elections. As a former prosecutor and now a trial court judge, I'm just curious to know, as a practical matter from a boots on the ground perspective, how it is that you believe judges can assist in the progressive work that you're doing on the prosecution side.
Say your question again, I didn't hear it all. How can judges help?
Yes.
Oh my God. Get me started.
We probably shouldn't start with you.
Let me tell you, having been a progressive judge and with a group of 17 judges, I'm gonna be honest with you, it wasn't always easy. Okay, and a lot of the things I did, the reentry court, diversion court, and just sticking with criminal justice reform, I got a lot of feet stuck in front of me to kind of trip me up. Today, I'm just gonna be honest with you. Out of all the stakeholders in the criminal justice system, my felony court judges are the most difficult ones for me to deal with. When you ask to go down to speak to them and to explain what the policies are and how you can be helpful in what you're doing to help them, and you don't even get a response back, that's not good. When we have a 300-bed treatment facility and you offer to pay from your own funds for an assessment and you don't get a response back, that's not good. So I think what judges need to do, I think that there needs to be more training on evidence-based practices for judges so that judges can stop being either the defense lawyer, the prosecutor, or both that they were before they took the bench, and think from an entirely different perspective as to what the outcomes are. Once again, how effective is my sentence, and what types of things am I taking into consideration? Do I understand the assessments that are being done? Am I guided? Am I doing what the assessments say, or am I just allowing them to be some more information, additional information to make a good decision? And those are the things that I think, generally speaking, judges can do. And for those that are in jurisdictions where we have progressive prosecutors, we're not the enemy, okay? We're not the enemy. We want you to succeed. And we want you to have a better outcome for the cases that you have in the jurisdiction. So to the extent that we all as stakeholders work together, I think we have a better, safer community.
Can I just jump in on that for a second? So my wife has been a trial judge in Philadelphia for 19 years. And therefore, I not only have compassion for her, I do have a lot of compassion, having been a 4 to 5 day a week trial lawyer in the system for almost 30 years as a defense attorney and civil rights lawyer before I got here. There is a judge I like very much who loves to say, when you know better, you have to do better. And the point she was making to me is that to a large extent what happens to judges is they sit in their own courtroom. They do not have a chance to observe what other judges are doing, and people patronize them all day long. People say that's wise and wonderful, your jokes are the funniest, everything that you ever said or did is great. It is part of the nature of the system. And it's actually not good for the brain. No one is really sitting around saying, let us bring this really great educational program to these judges, and judges deserve that. They deserve to have that. So you got Vinny Schiraldi sitting over here. Right there. Hi, Vinny. Vinny Schiraldi arguably knows more about probation and parole, community supervision, and things that are incredibly impactful with mass incarceration, among other things, than anybody in the country. And he has been to Philadelphia, and he has done a number of educational stops where he lays it all out with his beautiful slide presentation, but it has been a struggle to get those judges in the room. As a judge, one of the things that you can do is make a way to have really good educational programs available so that judges who want to do better can know better, and therefore they'll be in a position to do that. Obviously, there's a lot more. Like, let's be honest, we should all be in our own lanes, right? It's not actually the role of the judiciary when the district attorney is giving them their lane to take over the lane of the district attorney. And we have a little bit of that going on some of the time in Philadelphia, but I also want to be clear, you know, one size just does not fit all. The notion that all judges are the same is completely unfair. The notion that all police officers are the same is completely unfair. And often what we see in the press is the coverage of controversy. So it's the smaller number of judges shaking their fist as opposed to the larger number of judges who really are open to these good things and are moving with changes.
And I just want to say, unlike The judges in Massachusetts have been wonderful. I've sort of gone on this world tour of our chief of trial courts, our chief of district courts, the chief of the Boston Municipal Court. They've all been incredibly welcoming, our juvenile courts, to talk about my policy memo and to say, as you know, as a candidate, I reached out and none of you responded because I was one of 5 candidates. Now that I'm the DA, everyone's like, oh my God, what is she doing? Well, if I had to get consensus, it would have happened on the last day before my 4-year term was over. This is what I'm proposing. What are your pain points? You can be honest with us and let us know, and we will take that into account as well. But I agree with what Larry said.
If you've enjoyed this conversation, I'd like to refer you all to some papers out of the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution on some of the subjects we've touched on today. They're created by an executive session that featured some of their progressive prosecutor colleagues, some of the incredible experts in this room. There are some available outside, and they're available on www.prosecution.org. Now, in a lightning blast round, why are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful because I think that there's becoming a groundswell of progressive prosecutors across the United States. I think we have some basic things in common. We have different sentencing systems, but we have basic things in common, and as long as we can keep that going and we can keep the communities energized and behind us, I think we can keep the movement going.
I'm hopeful because these are my colleagues, Marilyn and DA Harrington from Berkshire County, Massachusetts. What's up? We have some great people that we are working with, and we have a whole new group that are coming forward. I was fortunate to have Larry, Kim Fox, Kim Gardner, others to look up to. Now the next group has us to look up to, and we're going to change this one prosecutor at a time.
This sounds kind of gruesome and weird, but I am hopeful because we are seeing the results of the fact that the system has been so awful for so long, and it has affected so many people in their own lives, in their families, on their blocks, and in their work lives, that people are not going to put up with it. The fact is, the fortress is surrounded in major cities, and major cities are the drivers of mass incarceration. They just are. It doesn't actually matter all that much what some tiny rural jurisdiction does when they have a total of 1 prosecutor and 2 judges. But what does matter is what's going on in all the major cities in terms of making real progress and making real reforms. So I'm afraid to some extent they have given us this victory because they have been so punitive and so hateful. There is such a lived experience around this that the fortress will not hold with all those people standing around it, kicking at it. Those walls are going to come down, and we are absolutely going to get where we all need to go with criminal justice reform.
I hope that you all have the same feeling of hope that they've just expressed, and I'm so grateful to you all for joining us today. Thank you to your fellow prosecutors in the audience, to all of you for your service.